Hello, this is Professor Nassar, and today we are going to talk about the histology of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, for those of you who have seen it, I put up also or for those of you who have not seen it, I put up a sort of a little whiteboard talk before making this presentation. And for those who have it available, you should look at that first because it gives you a bit of a comparison, sort of in cartoon form, of what we're going to be seeing here. Today we're going to be looking at 4 slides, a slide of each slide representative of a different portion of the gastrointestinal tract. The first slide will be of the esophagus, the second slide will be of the stomach, the third slide will be of the small intestine, specifically a part of the small intestine called the duodenum, and the fourth slide will be part of the slide of the large intestine, specifically part of the colon. What I'm going to do here is, what you should have with you is a copy of your lab manual. And what I'm going to go through is basically just run down the list, admittedly a bit quickly because again you can stop and review this on your own time. I'm not going to go through a thorough explanation of what everything is. I mostly going to identify parts of what's what, and also go around the slide a little bit just to give you a bit of a context of what it is that you are looking at and how histologists approach these different types of organs. Because of the circumstances, and you will not have a chance unless, of course, you own a microscope and slides of your own at home, I'm sort of doing this now to sort of help you along in the hopes that it gives you a little bit further context and assistance for the upcoming lab exams. Okay, let's start with the esophagus. I'm going to be off screen part of the time by the podium as I manipulate the slide, and then I will come back here and point out some features. Sometimes I'll use the mouse, and sometimes I'll use a pointer. With the esophagus, what we're going to be looking at here is essentially a tube that looks like this. Keep in mind, when you're looking at these slides, the GI tract is basically a tube, and so when they take sections of it, sometimes in your microscope you're going to see a circular structure with a lumen inside. It will look like a cross-section of this piece of paper, tube-like. But sometimes what they do to prepare the slide is they cut the tube open, and what you're going to see is essentially a flat surface. The tube has been unrolled. So sometimes the slide sections will be like this, and the lumen, at least in terms of how I will orient the slides, will be sort of up top, and the outside of the GI will be below. And sometimes the gut tube is small and will be intact, in which case the lumen will be in the center. Okay, typical esophagus looks something like this. This is a slide from your textbook. I just want to start with this as to give you some context. Again, in all of these slides, we're going to be looking for 4 tissue layers because the organization of the gastrointestinal tract, for the most part, is the same. What is really amazing about it, though, is that depending on where you are in your GI tract, the tissue layers are modified to specialize to do certain types of things. What's surprising to some is when they look at something like this and they're told that it's their esophagus. At least it was surprising to me. This thing is the lumen of your esophagus. Now, most of you, when you think of your esophagus, you think of like a tube which food goes down through. What you have to realize is that the esophagus, for the most part, spends most of its time as a tube, but the tube and the lumen are collapsed, which is why you get all these sort of funny shapes and stuff of the lumen in here. It's not like when you look at the cross-section of your trachea, where the trachea stays open and patent because it has all these nice supporting hyaline cartilages surrounding it to keep its shape. The esophagus gets no such frills or luxury. It basically spends its life collapsed, and in fact, it helps you to stay in a collapsed state because when food goes through it, that food pushes the wall of the epithelium and also the other layers sort of out of the way. It distorts them and bends them out, and that allows you to send signals to your brain and other parts of your GI that, hey, wake up guys, food is coming down, and stimulates things like peristalsis. Okay, so there are 4 tissue layers that we want you to identify and keep and appreciate as we go through the GI tract. first is the, well, not the tissue layer, but it's the lumen. The first tissue layer surrounding that will be the mucosa layer, which is shown here in dark purple, or maybe light purple, bright purple. Then the second layer is the submucosa. The mucosa consists of a few different subdivisions. The first layer is epithelium, and if you recall in the esophagus, the epithelium is stratified squamous. The second layer is the submucosa. This consists of connective tissue. The third layer is called muscularis externa. It's composed of smooth muscle, and it contains two layers. The inner layer is called the circular layer. The outer is called the longitudinal layer. They are called this, recall, based on the orientation of the smooth muscle. If this pointer here were a smooth muscle cell, in this case, in the circular layer, you're seeing a side view of the smooth muscle cell. It would be oriented like this, or like this, or like this, like that, like that. It basically forms a ring around the whole esophagus, sort of like one gigantic sphincter. The longitudinal layer, the smooth muscle, is coming in and out of the screen. Instead of oriented like this in the inner layer, it's oriented like this. So it runs parallel with the length of the gut tube. And in this case, when this muscle shortens, the whole tube shortens in length. So inner circular layer, outer longitudinal layer, two layers of smooth muscle, and then finally a thin little wispy layer of connective tissue that sort of holds the esophagus to other organs around it, and in this area that is called adventitia. Next, what I'd like to do is go to Professor Alexis's website just to give you an overview, because he takes some wonderful photos of your slides. I want to just give a shout out to Professor Alexic for having the foresight to do this. Slides like these, I think, really help the students and help me too to review during times when students don't have access to the microscopes in the lab. Thank you, Professor Alexic, for thinking to do this and for putting this up for us and taking the time out to make this many years ago. Okay, so let's go through the parts. Again, the main tissue layers that we're looking for. The four main tissue layers. The lumen is up here. In all of these slides, the lumen will be at the top. So the lumen is here. Your Doritos that you're eating are going down here, or down through this passageway. This is the mucosal layer, submucosal layer, and then this slide is too big to fit everything on one image. So here's the bottom of the submucosal layer, here's the muscularis externa, and then here's the adventitia. Now let's go through the details of each of those four layers. In the mucosal layer, you have, remember, the mucosal layer is divided into three regions. The epithelium, which in this case is stratified squamous. This layer of connective tissue, which some books call lamina propria, or proper layer. In this slide, he calls it your basement membrane. In some texts use this term as well. And then finally, the third subdivision of the mucosa is muscularis mucosa. It's basically a thin layer of smooth muscle. The smooth muscle in the muscularis mucosa is no different than the smooth muscle that makes up the muscularis externa. It's all just smooth muscle. In this case, you just have an extra layer of smooth muscle that makes up the bottom of the mucosal layer of tissue. And in this case, it's relatively thick. It's all of these pink ribbons or pink bands that you see here throughout the slide. In the submucosa, you get something funny going on in the esophagus. We'll see this again when we look at the duodenum. There are all these sort of white, puffy, cloud-like structures that you see here. And these puffy structures are called mucus glands. The reason they look so light and white is because there are cells here, and they're just basically producing water, or mucus. Really, mucus. Water with a few substances thrown in there for good measure. The gland is this. There's one here, another here, and so on. The individual components of the gland are these grape-like structures that are secreting the product. The cells make up these grape-like structures that in some texts are called alveoli, like the alveoli of your lung. Some books will call this in a sinus. It's really a distinction in terms of the shape of this sort of grape-like structure that's secreting a product. The cells that make up the alveoli or the sinus are here. They sort of form a ring-like shape, and it's a layer of simple, it's glandular tissue, so it's simple. Remember what epithelium glandular tissue is made up of? That's right, simple cuboidal epithelium. And you can see them here, and a ring of them here. And what happens is they secrete their product into a lumen, right there and right there. Where does that product go? It goes up to the surface. How does it get there? Well, your esophagus builds a duct that connects this to that. The duct here is shown very nicely here. Here is a mucus gland, two alveoli. They secrete their product, and then the product goes in. See, there's a lumen there. That lumen is surrounded by epithelial cells, and that is a duct. The duct goes through here, and then we lose it a little bit because it goes out of the range of the tissue slice, and then comes back up in here, and ultimately empties up into the lumen. Do you see another duct on this slide? Oh, well, okay, yeah, I can see labels from here and here, but there's even another one which is unlabeled, maybe two. Good, there's one here, and there's another one here. This is a nice slide in terms of, he shows lots of ducts. Not all of your slides that you see you'll have such nice looking ducts sort of lined up in a row like this. And ideally, an even better slide, you would be able to see the duct connecting from the lumen back to the mucus gland. But since this is a thin slide, this is pretty good. All right, so now let's look at the real slide, our slide. This is what we see. Up top is the lumen. Here is your simple squamous epithelium. When you zoom in on this, you should convince yourself that you are looking at not a single layer of cells, but many layers of cells. Below that is the basement membrane or lamina propria, a layer of connective tissue. And these bundles of pink here are the muscularis mucosa layer, make up the muscularis mucosa layer. So this and this and this make up your mucosal layer. Stratified squamous epithelium, lamina propria, muscularis mucosa. Below that, we have these puffy white clouds. This is part of the submucosal layer. The submucosal layer starts really right about there and goes down to about here. Incorporated into submucosa are your mucus glands, sometimes called esophageal glands in the submucosa. Below that, we have two layers of smooth muscle. Because we're in the esophagus, some of this muscle may actually even be skeletal muscle, depending on where they slice the esophagus and what type of species of animal this was taken from. But in any case, there's an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. And then after that, we have a little bit of serosa. In the esophagus, it's not always easy to distinguish, again, depending on the slice, the inner versus the outer in terms of when we look more closely at the orientation of the smooth muscle, it may not be exactly how we like it. Professor Alexic had a nice view of it there on my slide. It's not as nice, but you can see sort of a line of distinction here. My colleagues may disagree with me and may have a different opinion of this, so I apologize if I get this wrong, but I would just call this the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer here, and put the dividing line roughly about there. Like I said, not everyone may agree with me. I'm not perfect with the histology, but that's how I would call it. If someone else wants to, if someone else thinks differently, I would appreciate or hearing their opinion. Let's take another look at another esophagus slide here. Again, this is a little more convoluted, but what it shows quite nicely are the ducts. So again, the lumen is here. Again, in this case, the esophagus is a bit squashed. Stratified squamous epithelium, lamina propria, or basement membrane, and then some little bits and pieces of the muscularis mucosa. Submucosa with esophageal glands. Submucosa continues and then we have the two layers of the muscularis externa, inner circular, outer longitudinal. Here we can also see some very nice ducts that connect the mucus glands and the secretion of the mucus glands with the lumen. There's one here and another here. Another, this looks like more muscularis mucosa here, and part of the mucosal layer there. Okay, I think we're good for that. Let's move on to the next slide, which will be of the stomach. Before we start with the slide of the stomach, again, let's do a quick review of what we should expect to see schematically with regard to the histology. If you are walking along the surface of the stomach, recall that the stomach is going to look relatively flat, but it will be studded with a number of invaginations which form pits, or gastric pits, gastric because we're in the stomach. The epithelium that lines the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine is all of the same type. Do you remember what it is? That's right, it's simple columnar epithelium. It changes when we move from the esophagus to the stomach. The esophagus is stratified squamous epithelium. It's relatively thick, again, to protect your esophagus from the sharp edges of the Doritos that you might be eating, or other hot items or crunchy items that might be traveling through there. But when the stomach reaches the esophagus, as you transition from the esophagus to the, when the esophagus reaches the stomach, and as you transition from the esophagus to the stomach, the epithelium changes its nature as well, and turns into simple columnar epithelium, and it stays that way throughout the rest of the GI tract until we get to the anus, when it turns back into stratified squamous epithelium. Here we have a gastric pit, and the gastric pit, if you were to fall down it, you would fall down into, it might sort of bifurcate into these structures here, which are called gastric glands. Simple columnar epithelium makes up the whole structure. Again, this is a glandular structure, and we want you to identify 3 different kinds of cells. The bulk of these cells are called mucus cells, and they produce mucus. They produce a layer of slime that basically coat the entire lining of your stomach. What's incorporated in that slime or mucus is essentially water, but also a substance called bicarbonate to offset the acidity that's going to be secreted by other cells in your stomach. The gastric pit leads to this structure called the gastric gland, which basically forms sort of the deeper version of this pit. And in the gastric gland, you also get mucus cells, but you also get 2 other cell types. Parietal cells, which secrete hydrochloric acid, and chief cells, which secrete pepsinogen. On your slides, the parietal cells are going to look pink, the chief cells are going to look blue. Your slide is going to look something like this. Here, the lumen is to the left, is to the right. The mucosal layer is from here to here, and it consists of simple columnar epithelium with gastric pits. So again, the surface of the stomach is here. If you were walking along the side of the stomach, again, remember it's a tube. So you're walking along the side of the tube. You'd be walking along this surface here, and you'd be trying to basically avoid falling into these pits. The bottom of the pit is all the way down here. The beginning of the gastric pit is here, and then the gastric pit, the bottom part, or basically the rest of the pit, is called the gastric gland, where you're going to have your parietal and chief cells. We don't really see, the parietal and chief cells are here. They're not very distinct on this slide, but there's a second slide that we will bring up that shows them a little more distinctly. . At the bottom, you have a muscularis mucosa, a thin layer here, and that's the end of your mucosal layer. Then you have a submucosal layer, maybe even a little bit of an artificial gap here, and then finally, you can see a little bit of the muscularis external. The outer stomach looks like this. Here again is the submucosa, and then there's not 2, but 3 layers of smooth muscle. An inner oblique layer, where the orientation, it's called oblique because the orientation of the smooth muscle cells basically goes in and out of your field of view at a bit of an angle. Then you have a middle circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. Again, the orientation of the smooth muscle cells in the middle circular layer here is like this. The orientation of the smooth muscle cells in the outer longitudinal layer is like this. It's coming in and out of the screen at you. And then finally, a thin layer of wispy connective tissue, which we call serosa. In the next slide, he shows you detail of the parietal and chief cells in the gastric gland. So where are we here? We are, if you go back to this slide, we are now in this region. We're going to be zooming in on this area where the gastric glands are. So now we are in the gastric glands. Here are the parietal cells. You can see there are lots of them. There are all these bright pink cells here. And in blue, we have the chief cells, shown here in dark blue. And you can see there are chief cells here and here and here. Anything dark blue is going to be a chief cell. Anything bright pink will be a parietal cell. Remember that the gastric glands lead to gastric pits. And here on this slide, you can see the gastric pit is basically this tube that goes down and ends sort of at a dead end. And it's a nice big open tube that you can see here. On your slide, these gastric pits are really smushed because all the cells and the tissue get smushed together. So it's not so easy to appreciate the lumens of these gastric pits and the lumens of the gastric glands in the slide, but he tries to point them out here. Sorry, that's the heat, the AC and the HVAC turning on and off in the background. So here is one lumen. Here is another lumen, this is another lumen, and so forth. All these spaces here are lumens that lead back up to the gastric pits, and then would lead back out to the lumen of the stomach. The idea is that these parietal cells are secreting hydrochloric acid, these chief cells are secreting pepsinogen. Those secretions go into these lumens and then make their way up to the gastric pits and then sort of erupt out of the gastric pits onto the surface of the stomach. This is the bottom of the gastric gland. Here is your submucosal layer, or maybe a little bit of muscularis mucosa, and then your submucosal layer. This is the bottom of the gastric gland. The pits basically dead end into these, the tube ends here, into what is labeled here as an asinus. The plural of asinus, A-C-I-N-U-S, is asina. So there's a dead end pouch here, a dead end pouch here, and so forth. But you can see the lumen there surrounded by chief cells, simple columnar epithelial cells. They secrete their product into this lumen. That lumen then goes up through the gastric pit and then back up to the surface of the stomach. You can see more parietal cells here in pink. Okay, so let's look at our stomach. Our stomach looks something like this. Again, the lumen is at the top. And one of the things to appreciate here is, whoa, you get these rather beautiful swells of tissue appearing in the stomach. These swells of tissue are called rugae. They are folds of the stomach that can sort of flatten out or curl back up, depending on what the stomach is trying to do in terms of helping you digest your food for things like peristalsis and such. Let's go through the different parts. Again, if you were walking along the surface of the stomach, you'd be walking along here. You can see there's a, the surface would be here, and this would be a gastric pit, surface, pit, and so forth. This is all part of the gastric gland. This is all part of the gastric gland, and so on. And then you have a thin layer of muscularis mucosa, shown here sort of in light blue. And then forming sort of the core of this rugae is submucosa. as we make our way down, we can see the following. Here is the submucosal layer. So, here is the muscularis mucosa. So this is the base of the mucosal layer. All of this is submucosa. We call the submucosal layers where you have a lot of blood vessels and nerve traveling through. So you would expect to see a lot of lumens like these and like these. These are basically arteries, veins, lymphatic channels traveling through the submucosal layer. And occasionally you'll see some nerve bundles too. So all of this wispy tissue here is submucosa, and then you have three layers of smooth muscle. The inner oblique layer, the middle circular layer from here to here, and then the outer longitudinal layer from here to here. The oblique layers from here to here. And then finally, you have a layer of serosa at the bottom. The other stomach slide I want to show you looks like this. It's a bit different and much thinner. Either it's thinner because it comes from a different species of animal, or it's thinner because we're just looking at a different portion of the stomach. This part, the slide says it's the stomach of the fundic section. Actually, the previous slide also said fundic section too, so maybe it's just coming from a different species. But in any case, the purpose of this slide is, we can see also the different layers, but the purpose of this slide is really to help you appreciate parietal and chief cells in the gastric glands. Again, let's go through the parts. The lumen is up here. This would be the surface, and then the gastric pits you can see all throughout here, lined by simple columnar epithelial cells. The gastric pit is basically from here down to here, and you can see it's lined by these purple and pink cells. The pink are the parietal, the purple are the chief cells, and then the dead end down here in the acini. You can see also the lumens for the gastric pits here, or for the gastric glands, I apologize, here, and so on. Let's zoom in on that a little bit. So again, in blue are your chief cells, pink are your parietal cells. Then you have a thin layer of muscularis mucosa, a very thin submucosal layer, and then all of this would be the muscularis externa. Let's look at those layers here. With this slide, the muscularis externa is basically, it's hard to see an oblique layer. I really just see sort of two layers here, where you have an inner circular and an outer longitudinal. The dividing line is roughly about there. This is outer longitudinal, and above the pointer here is inner circular, outer longitudinal. Maybe this is an oblique layer. I wouldn't, well, but it's harder to appreciate. Maybe if you use your imagination, you could call this layer the oblique layer, the middle circular layer, and then the outer longitudinal layer, if you want to be consistent with the text. Submucosa is this layer, very, very thin, and where the pointer is here is on the muscularis mucosa of the mucosal layer, and all of this is gastric gland. Okay, next let's look at the duodenum. I just want to make sure we're still recording and the recording looks okay. Yep. Okay, this slide is a bit faint, but it works. And what we're looking at here is part of the duodenum, part of your small intestine, specifically the part of your intestine, the small intestine just after your stomach. So in this case, the slide is still of a tube, so you're seeing a cross section of the tube. So the lumen is this structure here in the middle.